You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 413, recorded on Sunday, February 13th, 2022. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line from Idaho, as always, is Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill.
The 19th century was a time for experimentation in chemistry, consolidation of corporations, and expansion of imperialism to remote and obscure corners of the globe. All three of these trends came together in the field of explosives for war, mining, quarrying, tunneling, and more. To get sufficient quantities of ingredients for these explosives, the U.S. empire expanded, and that growth in turn stood atop the quantity, quality, and innovation of the explosives on hand. In the same era that saw the consolidation of sugar into a monopoly, covered in episode 376 from May 2021, the same thing was happening in the explosives industry. And the commonality doesn't stop there because of the importance of islands and horrific labor conditions. So this week we're focusing on 19th century American explosives and Guano Islands imperialism. We'll start off by talking about the classic, the OG, original gunpowder. Gunpowder, a compound typically used as a propellant more than an explosive, was more or less standardized by the 1780s after centuries of trial and error and irregular production formulas and methods. Later in this episode, we'll talk about guano-derived potassium nitrate, aka saltpeter, always the biggest ingredient unless substituted with sodium nitrate, but gunpowder also included charcoal and, in order to lower the ignition temperature, sulfur. There were different ingredient ratios for different uses, such as guns versus rockets, but also civilian uses. For example, blasting powder for mining was further refined, standardized, and patented by DuPont, the most important U.S. munitions company, in 1857. DuPont had been operating a gunpowder factory in Delaware since 1802, and they were the Union's leading supplier during the American Civil War in the 1860s. Just 4 powder mills in the northeastern U.S., owned by 4 companies including DuPont, were producing 69% of U.S. gunpowder at the height of wartime production. One of the other big suppliers was Laughlin, which had been in the industry since the American Revolution. 7 years after the war, these 4 firms formed a trade association, basically a cartel, that dominated the industry in the 1870s, and DuPont actually continued gunpowder production for a further century until 1971. Although there had been over 200 powder mills in the U.S. back in 1810, often small ones, this was an industry that was well suited to industrial mergers and consolidations that became such a defining feature of the Second Industrial Revolution because if a powder mill exploded, it was easier for a big firm with deep pockets to recover and rebuild instead of going out of business. The mill sites also required a lot of land and complicated, expensive building arrangements for accidental blast mitigation. For example, the Confederate Powder Works in Augusta, Georgia stretched across 1.5 miles, although this was unusually large. Until the advent of electricity, powder mills were also generally powered by water wheels, not steam engines, as a further precaution against accidental explosions of the product. On the other hand, water and humidity were the enemies of dry powder production and usefulness. Gunpowder had always been problematic for industrial production and industrial scale uses in mining, quarrying, tunneling, and warfare, because even if you were willing to write off the inherent dangers of gunpowder as the cost of doing business, it was extremely messy, prone to causing mechanical failure in guns or mining equipment, and threw huge black clouds into the air immediately upon use, obscuring everyone's ability to do their job. So, apart from the first Industrial Revolution's contribution to the field in the form of standardized gunpowder, what we would today anachronistically label as things like black powder and bee blasting powder, and factory production of various graphite-coated grain sizes and less erratic propulsion from clumping, substitutes for gunpowder had to wait until the Second Industrial Revolution. By the mid-1840s, gun cotton, which we discussed in our episodes on nitrocellulose for film reels and Jules Verne's ideas about spaceflight, had indeed been developed in Europe. But gun cotton was not safely manufacturable for mass production for nearly 2 decades, eventually being deployed in the American Civil War for new high-explosive shell artillery, as opposed to more traditional powder-launched cannonball artillery, which was also in use but had that powder haze problem. After this, in the Second Industrial Revolution, the race was on to develop and mass-produce replacements for gunpowder for military and civilian purposes. DuPont built a gun cotton factory in New Jersey, and eventually they achieved total monopoly control of all smokeless powder patents in the U.S., and were forced to divest in 1912 due to antitrust enforcement, although by that point they had significantly consolidated American production. The California Powder Works, which produced at various points nitroglycerin, Peyton powder, and Hercules powder, was an early and important Second Industrial Revolution explosives factory and was originally created out of necessity when California was suddenly cut off from reliable access to Eastern-made mining explosives during the Civil War. It is one of the clearer examples of the constant intermingling of the development and production of civilian explosives and military explosives, which partly reflected the reality that mining, quarrying, and transport tunneling were big and long-term national industries, whereas the U.S. military was once kept very small except during major wars like the Civil War. The California Powder Works, located in the Santa Cruz area for about half a century, were eventually integrated into the DuPont explosives production empire in the early 1900s, following a significant factory explosion in the late 1890s. Dynamite was, of course, another significant explosive, especially for those civilian uses like mining and digging tunnels or rock cuts for railroads, things like that. Now, dynamite, of course, was not a U.S. invention. Most of our listeners will probably be aware that Alfred Nobel, the Swedish guy for whom the Nobel Prize is named, and he was the funder behind it, he patented dynamite in 1867. But, of course, dynamite was extensively used in the U.S. and, unsurprisingly, reformulated here. Now, dynamite replaced the use of, or more accurately, we should say, enclosed in safe diatomaceous earth, the highly unstable nitroglycerin explosives, which had to be manufactured on-site at blasting projects because it was unsafe to ship. The U.S. Army used dynamite extensively in San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake to try to create fire breaks. In 1910, DuPont published a pamphlet on suggested uses of dynamite in day-to-day farm activities, primarily as an efficient way to clear obstacles. Smokeless powder was another substitute for the original gunpowder that we would now refer to as black powder. Smokeless powder is not really one specific thing. It's more of a generic term for various reformulations of nitrocellulose or gun cotton propellants, sometimes mixed with nitroglycerin. And the idea was to get basically three major things achieved. It needed to be less hazy, less dangerous, and less failure prone for small arms or artillery use than black powder had been. Smokeless powder was developed by 1884 and was extensively used after that, and it was also not a U.S. invention, but it was crucial to the U.S. arms industry, including things like the Winchester repeating rifles. Now, there were earlier designs before 1884 of Winchester repeating rifles. These had been popularized by significant purchase orders in the Civil War by the Union Army, but they really needed to be sort of maximally effective. They needed to have smokeless powder. To give sort of one specific illustration of the advantages of smokeless powder, it is, at this point, unfortunately, the birth of modern snipers as a significant thing. Sharpshooters previously could not be concealed for any length of time because black powder haze gave away their position after basically one shot. And you can also imagine some hunting applications for the same point. White powder or smokeless powder not only didn't give away a sniper's hiding spot after firing, but it also allowed for much longer distance shots with more accuracy due to the higher velocity of the bullets, so there was less vertical drop or lateral wind drift. And again, this is all because of the reformulation of the propellant. And it's important to remember that things like gunpowder or its substitutes are primarily kinetic propellants rather than explosives, although we did talk about the blasting-specific variants for things like mining and quarrying. Once again, the major firms in that post-1872 cartel that we mentioned earlier, such as Laughlin, were key players in developing or acquiring patents or existing smaller factories for smokeless powder variants. So, by 1900, DuPont and Laughlin controlled between themselves over 2/3 of U.S. explosives production, and then DuPont bought out Laughlin, becoming the de facto monopoly until 1912, as previously mentioned. Another example of a company that was working in this field was the Anglo-American Explosives Company, and they were also based in the Northeast. They had a smokeless shotgun powder factory in New Jersey in the 1890s, and the idea was to take advantage of smokeless powder's particular usefulness in smoothbore guns as opposed to rifled barrels, although as we talked about with the Winchester repeating rifles and snipers and things like that, there was obviously a pretty significant use case for smokeless powder in rifled barrels as well. So we've talked now about things like the U.S. Army's role in being a purchaser for a lot of this gunpowder and its subsequent substitutes. But the U.S. Navy also had a massive role in the explosives industry, which is what we're going to be talking a lot about for the rest of this episode. So there were a number of facilities where direct R&D was happening within the U.S. Navy as opposed to just the private sector. There was a naval powder factory in Maryland that developed various nitrocellulose-based propellants or explosives in the late 1890s and then sold the patents to DuPont, although the naval powder factory could keep producing it as well. And today that is still a U.S. Navy R&D facility, the Indian Head Naval Surface Warfare Center, which designs explosives, propellants, pyrotechnics, and ordnance for use by the U.S. Navy. Their other facility was the Naval Torpedo Station at Newport, Rhode Island, opened in 1869, and they developed Indurite, which was a nitrocellulose or gun cotton reformulation in the early 1890s, which was a kind of smokeless powder variant, and that actually proved so useful over the long run that it proved crucial to both World War I and World War II, and that today is part of the Naval Undersea Warfare Center. And there was another explosive designed by the U.S. Navy, which was called Dunite, or Explosive D, and that was the U.S. Navy's preferred shell explosive in World War I for time-delayed exploding shells after ripping through the ship armor. So that, again, is a distinction from the propellant, which is that you need, once it's been propelled and pierces the armor, then it needs to explode, and so they used Dunite for that. And before we move on, I just want to note again, we've talked here about various research and development and production, and a lot of this had to do with figuring out how to make it safer to transport and things like that, and also less likely to have problems. One of the big problems in the production phase, transport phase, and even the use phase tended to be moisture contamination, which I alluded to earlier. And you may recall that we actually talked about this on our episode about air conditioning, because air conditioning became a significant force after being expanded substantially for the purposes of maintaining humidity levels in powder factories for World War I. So another tie back to a previous episode. But I don't want to get away from the U.S. Navy here because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, there is another naval angle on the U.S. explosives industry. Obviously, the private sector, a significant force here, but the Navy was very crucial, not just for research and development and patenting various designs, but also for actually acquiring some of the critical ingredients. And for that, we're going to turn now to Rachel to talk about guano and the American Overseas Territorial Empire, which is basically inextricable from the gunpowder industry, although you might more often hear about things like coaling stations and so forth, which we talked about on our aircraft carriers episode.
So guano, what is it? It is manure from any flying animal. But what we're going to talk about is guano from seabirds and bats. So guano is is a good source of nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. And the different types of guano do differ in composition. So bird guano is very high in nitrogen due to the seabird's diet of fish. And bird guano can be up to 21% nitrogen by mass. And bird guano is also a significant source of calcium and magnesium. Bat guano contains a high amount of carbon, especially the fresh guano, as well as nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. And bird guano tends to accumulate on rocky islands where they have their rookeries. They're usually uninhabited. They don't have predators. So then these islands just get covered in layers and layers of bird guano that accumulates over decades or even centuries. Bat guano tends to be contained in caves because that's where the bats live and sleep. And so bat guano is a little bit harder to get to. There's much more of a typical mining operation that has to happen in a cave. So what is guano used for? Due to its high potassium and nitrogen content, it was sought after in the 19th century for both agricultural fertilizer and gunpowder production, following an 1802 publication by globally famous German naturalist explorer Alexander von Humboldt, for whom many American places are named, and an 1813 publication by Humphrey Davy of Britain. It was also a lucrative secondary transport good for empty whaling ships. The peak guano age was from about 1840 to 1883, and it reached a fever pitch in the 1870s, but the implications were profound for years to come until the advent of synthetic ammonia fertilizers in 1913 in Germany. So the main source for my section is How to Hide an Empire by Daniel Immerwahr. And he had a really good chapter that explains both the cause of the guano rush and also the results for U.S. empire building. So what caused the American guano rush? Britain had a monopolistic stranglehold on guano that was mainly exported from islands off the coast of Peru. And because Britain had this monopolistic stranglehold, they kept prices high. And so as the U.S. was seeking to source guano for their industrial projects, they were running into this high price problem. So they were really seeking to figure out a way to acquire guano for themselves and get out from under the thumb of Britain and their cartel. So guano prices were of such importance that the subject appeared in 4 presidential annual messages. Millard Fillmore, in particular, stressed that he saw it as, quote, the duty of the government, unquote, to secure guano at a, quote unquote, reasonable price. In the address, he said, nothing will be omitted on my part in the search for a supply of cheap guano. And this statement actually led to a near war between Peru and the U.S. in 1852, when Secretary of State Daniel Webster gave guano speculators the go-ahead to sail to the Lobos Islands off the coast of northern Peru and mine them for guano. Secretary of State Webster even promised naval protection and dispatched a warship for this purpose. Peru had claimed sovereignty over the islands, and they started preparing for a war with the U.S., with a Peruvian paper even admonishing its readers to, quote, exterminate the hated race, end quote, and, quote, kill before Peruvians should be killed, end quote. The U.S. did later back down, but it was clear that the question of sovereignty over Guano Islands was going to be a major problem of the time. So American speculators started to look to more far-flung, unclaimed islands for guano. 2 islands in the Central Pacific, Howland and Jarvis Islands, looked promising. They were more than 1,000 miles from the nearest large landmass, and they were known to whalers for decades. So these speculators quickly formed the American Guano Company and asked President Franklin Pierce to send the Navy to protect the company from foreign interference. And thus, the Guano Islands Act was passed in 1856. So the Guano Islands Act states that, quote, whenever any citizen of the United States discovers a deposit of guano on any island, rock, or key, not within the lawful jurisdiction of any other government, and not occupied by the citizens of any other government, and takes peaceable possession thereof, and occupies the same, such island, rock, or key may, at the discretion of the President, be considered as appertaining to the United States. It also allowed the President to use the military to protect these interests and establish the criminal jurisdiction of the U.S. in those territories. So the Guano Islands Act spurred a new land rush in the Pacific and Caribbean. By 1863, the U.S. had annexed 59 islands. By 1902, when the last claim under the act was filed, there were 94 guano islands, which created the beginnings of the U.S.'s oceanic empire. However, once the guano was discovered and claimed for the U.S., there was still the matter of mining the guano. Guano mining was a terrible and dangerous job. Breathing in the nitrogen-rich guano caused extensive lung damage, resulting in workers passing out or coughing up blood. Gastrointestinal diseases were also common, as there were no sources of fresh food or water on these desolate islands, and workers were forced into crowded accommodations. On Howland Island, there was also a rat infestation, adding another disease vector into the mix. And while Peruvian guano businesses used conscripted Chinese laborers, the U.S. used mainly Hawaiians on their Pacific mines, who they saw as a workforce hardened to the tropical conditions. However, these conditions were beyond just regular island living. It was very, very harsh, cruel conditions. One of the worst mines was in the Caribbean island of Navassa near Haiti, also known as Devil's Island. Navassa didn't have much actual guano, but its coral reefs had rich deposits of tricalcium phosphate, which was used as a component in fertilizer. The island was controlled by the Navassa Phosphate Company. The Navassa Phosphate Company hired African American laborers from Baltimore. The company promised a life of picking fruit and wooing beautiful women to get the workers to sign long-term contracts and sail to Navassa. Once there, the conditions were not as promised, but grueling and barbaric. The company overseers were abusive, and necessities such as clothes, mattresses, and pillows were sold to the workers in company stores at inflated prices. Workers who were too ill to work were fined, and workers who caused trouble were triced, which was being tied up for hours in the hot sun with their arms in the air and their feet barely touching the ground. Things finally came to a head in 1889 when an argument between an overseer and a worker touched off an uprising. White officers fired at their workers, who fought back with axes, dynamite, and stones. 5 white officers died in the fighting, and the workers were arrested and sent back to Baltimore to stand trial. This trial eventually came to the Supreme Court, known as Jones v. United States, in 1890. The defense stated that the rioters could not be convicted in a U.S. court because they lacked jurisdiction. Haiti also claimed sovereignty over Navassa. They also pointed to a lack of government presence on the island. If Navassa was truly a U.S. territory, where were the U.S. officials? The Supreme Court eventually sided with the prosecution, affirming that Navassa was U.S. territory and was under the rule of U.S. law. This ruling also affirmed the legality of U.S. empire building, the legacies of which are felt to this day, and according to the author Daniel Immerwahr, these legacies are: first, the legal establishment of the principle that the U.S. needn't be confined to the continent. Second, the strategic holdings of Pacific Islands. These islands later became desirable sites for airfields to hold a position in the U.S. military, far beyond the borders of the U.S. continent. And third, industrial agriculture as a means to feed an expanding population. While guano didn't live up to all its promises, its use did hold famine at bay until the industrialized manufacture of synthesized ammonia using atmospheric nitrogen in 1914 using the Haber-Bosch process. The Haber-Bosch process also allowed Germany to synthesize the ammonia necessary to manufacture nitrate explosives, to tie it back to the explosives industry. Germany's munitions were dwindling during World War I, and Haber's process restored Germany's capability to produce munitions. According to Immerwahr, the president of the American Chemical Society calculated that Germany would have lost the war by early 1916 had Haber not replenished its stocks of nitrate explosives. So this ammonium nitrate had many different applications, but it was the application in war that really helped Germany in the 1910s during World War I. But like ammonia nitrate was also used for many industrial processes like clearing the way for mines and other industrial applications as well. So it's kind of a double-edged sword for sure. All these inventions that came out, while being good for industrial applications, they were also definitely used to create munitions and make war much more deadly.
So did you have any thoughts on any of the other points?
I thought it was really interesting how the Northeast really took hold of the explosive industry and how it really took the Civil War for California to kind of step into the game. But it really does seem to be a very regional industry. I don't really hear much about modern explosives or propellants being manufactured in the Northwest at all. So it sounds like it's still definitely a Northeast industry.
Well, as we said, this is sort of tying together a number of things, even to the extent of getting into agricultural fertilizer, obviously, as Rachel talked about. But you can see here the sort of mergers of literal mergers of companies into, big monopoly on the explosives and munitions, but also this role of the U.S. military and empire building overseas as both the means to expand the empire and the means to have the means to expand the empire, getting those islands in order to have those guano deposits to be able to produce these munitions and so forth. And then talking about the chemistry advances and industrial research that was happening, of course, during the 19th century, and particularly the Second Industrial Revolution. So, Rachel, a fascinating topic. Thanks for coming on this week to talk about it.
It's always a pleasure.